Hi, I'm Dr. Chad Larson. Thanks for joining me in another episode of Keep It Real. Today is the fifth and final episode in our segment on 5 strategies to help combat symptoms associated with anxiety and other negative emotional states. So if you'll remember, the top 5 are breathing exercises. So in the first episode we talked about certain breathing exercises being really effective at lowering anxiety and other biochemical factors that are associated with anxiety and negative emotional states. And then number 2 was decreasing exposure to artificial blue light, right, that we get from our smartphones and e-readers and laptops and stuff like that. And particularly 2 to 3 hours before bedtime, because it showed that basically exposure to blue light during those times causes cortisol to go up and causes your melatonin to go down, which influences your sleep, which rolls us into strategy number 3, which was improving your sleep pattern, because we know that sleep is really vital to our mental, emotional, and mood state. And then number 4 was making better food choices, and we talked about some specific scientifically validated, all these concepts are scientifically validated, but we talked about how certain dietary changes could influence things like our cortisol and our blood sugar, and how those things can affect our mental, emotional state. And then today, number 5, we're going to discuss spending time in nature. And number 5 is all about how spending time in nature can decrease the physiological effects that contribute to anxiety and other negative emotional states. And so, to really further understand how spending time in nature affects our bodies, I looked into an interesting term that it's more of a practice, let's say, that's used in Japan. And it's called Shinrin-yoku. Shinrin-yoku is basically loosely translates to spending time in the forest, or forest bathing. Basically spending time in nature is what it means loosely. So it's a good model to study, because there's over a dozen really well done published research projects on the physiological benefits of Shinrin-yoku. So it's a very interesting model to read about. And I'll summarize the studies. There's been several of them, but I'll summarize them for you real quick and tell you how you could pretty easily start to incorporate this in your life. So basically what it is there's different ways that they looked at spending time in nature, or the Shinrin-yoku, but basically what they did was they would take a whole group of subjects, and they would put half of them in an urban setting and then the other half in a natural setting. And then before, during, and after, they'd take several measurements. They would take their blood pressure, they would take their heart rate, they would take their levels of salivary cortisol, and a few other measurements. And then they'd measure the before and after, and then they would compare that to the group that spent time in the urban compared to the natural environmental setting. And basically what they found out is that there was really significant improvements or significant physiological changes in the group that spent time in nature. And then they did a crossover study, meaning that all of the subjects groups experienced both of the research settings. In other words, the half that was started out in the urban went to the natural setting, and they took the same physiological measurements, and both groups, whether you started off in the natural setting or started off in the urban setting and then switched, they had significant improvements in those physiological measurements. And basically what those measurements were is they looked at cortisol. And remember, we talked about cortisol many times in this series on anxiety and negative emotional states. And we know that when cortisol is imbalanced, then that could be a physiological effect from this negative emotional state. And so by balancing cortisol, that helps to decrease some of these symptoms with these negative emotional states. And they found that spending time in nature significantly improved the cortisol balance. It also significantly improved a key part of our immune system called immunoglobulin A, or IgA. And IgA is mostly in our mucous membranes, like our mouth, nose, throat, gastrointestinal tract. And this is important because this is usually where we either inhale or ingest viruses or pathogens. And so that first line of immune defense is really, really key to getting ahead of that pathogen. So if we are in a chronic state of anxiety and negative emotional state, then that first line of immune defense can really start to drop down and make us more susceptible to these opportunistic pathogens. So by improving that first line of immune defense, that's a major physiological benefit. They also looked at heart rate, and so they found that heart rate significantly improved, and so did blood pressure. And so that's in one particular study. They evaluated all that, and then there's been some branch off studies where they looked at, they dove deeper, like into just one topic, like blood pressure. And they did a whole evaluation on, is actually hundreds of subjects looking at hypertension. And basically, hypertension is high blood pressure. Basically what it comes down to is it had a significant improvement on lowering blood pressure. And what's interesting is it all happened in a pretty short period of time. In fact, very short period of time. Most of the studies were just one day. In fact, the first study that I mentioned, again, there's like over a dozen of these, so they all kind of looked at it in slightly different ways, but basically they had the subjects first of all sit in a natural environment and just look out in nature for about 15 minutes. And then they'd take a very easy stroll through nature for about 15 minutes. And that was the whole research time, spending time in nature. So like about a half-hour time, either sitting or walking in nature, had these, really incredible physiological changes. So if you look at it, those things that we just mentioned, those are three really key parts of our physiology. So we talked about the immune system. We talked about the endocrine system, so the immune system with that IgA or immunoglobulin A improving. Also, I forgot to mention this, it also improved the NK cells, or natural killer cells. The NK cells are part of, they're like the white blood cell superstars. And these white blood cells, called natural killer cells, are really, really good at going after bad guys, viruses and abnormal cell growth and that kind of thing. So it improved your NK cells, your IgA or immunoglobulin A, that first line of immune defense, so that's the immune system. It helped to improve the endocrine system, which is cortisol. Remember, cortisol and the endocrine system have to do with anxiety and the autonomic nervous system, which is the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. If you remember, the sympathetic nervous system is like the fight or flight. It's, the body's kind of held in this kind of agitated state. And so we have the immune system, we have the endocrine system, and then we have the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is where we have the parasympathetic and sympathetic, and that's really measured by heart rate and the blood pressure. So as heart rate and blood pressure go down, then we know that the parasympathetic nervous system goes up. And when the parasympathetic nervous system goes up, that fight or flight sympathetic nervous system goes down. Our immune system improves, and anxiety and these negative emotional states go down. So just by spending a very short period of time in nature. So that's a lot of information to take in, but very easy to incorporate in your life, to spend 15, 20, 30 minutes in nature, just sitting there looking into nature, or taking a nice stroll like I'm doing through nature. It doesn't have to be a forest. It's just, in Japan, I guess that's what they have, is forests, and so that's where most of the studies were done, but any natural environment would do the trick. Here's what's interesting, is they also did similar studies in hospitals, in hospital rooms that had a window that faced some kind of natural setting as opposed to like a parking lot. The patients recovered faster, and they had fewer incidences of recurrence of whatever the issue was, of why they're in the hospital. They did the same thing in classrooms. What they did, there's an interesting study where they took, they placed 6 pretty large plants in the back of the classroom. That's all they did. They did nothing else. They didn't discuss it. All they did is they stuck 6 plants in the back of the classroom, and then they evaluated the students. This was a middle school classroom. They evaluated the students, and 2 really, really key things happened. There were fewer absences from illness, and behavioral issues. The records of behavioral issues went down, both very significantly. All they did is they stuck a little piece of nature in the back of the classroom and had that significant kind of effect. The same thing they've also done in work environments. And when work environments include some piece of nature into the work environment, then again, sick days go down, and sort of working kind of cultural morale improves. So either bring nature in with you if that's the best that you can do, and if you can do it, get out in nature and enjoy all those awesome benefits of these physiological changes to help your immune system, your nervous system, your endocrine system, and probably other things that they didn't even look at in these studies. So that's number 5 in the series. I hope you learned something, got something out of it, and we will keep reading the studies and bring the information to you. Until then, keep it real.